and for each of them, the corresponding source code has to be provided. Sometimes we also have different ways of distribution. We have digital satellite TV receivers that run Linux, for example, and we have seen firmware updates being communicated over the TV broadcast satellite to the device. Of course, that is distribution. It doesn't matter whether you send it over internet or on a CD-ROM or send it over the TV satellite. If the firmware update is broadcasted over the satellite, then you're distributing it, and you have to fulfill the license terms. With every method of distribution, it doesn't matter. So that needs to be thought of and thought about. Okay. That's the entire question of derivative works and GPL licensed software. I don't want to go into a detailed discussion of that, but what I want to come back again is, well, you can now, let's say you have an existing GPL license program, you create it, you want to modify it in some way, you want to add some functionality, and then you're trying, people are trying for a long time and put a lot of resources into the question, how can we do this without having to release our own software, without having to release whatever we do under the GPL? And my position is very clear on this. Whenever you try to do this, then you're trying to evade what the GPL tries to achieve. You're trying to evade, you're trying to avoid what the authors of that software originally intended. And if you're not violating the license text, you're at least violating the intention and the goal of the original authors of that software. And I would like to discourage people from doing that and work with the community, work together with the people who wrote that software, not against them. Okay, once again, take a break, go back one step. As I said, the license is not like the goal. The goal is collaborative software development. Intent of the license is to ensure everyone who receives the software should be able to modify it, enhance the software, and so on. So the more open the product is you create, the less you have to worry, because you will make the people in the community happy because they can modify it. If you use Linux and other free and open source software in a product, without enabling the community to make modifications or enhancement or making use of the freedom that free software tries to grant them, you're cheating, right? You're cheating, effectively. And whether or not that's a legal concern, right? I mean, that's something for the lawyers to work on, but you're cheating. And as I said, try to make friends in the community, not enemies. If you do license compliance from the beginning, it's relatively easy to do, right? If you think about license compatibility and licensing issues before you start R&D of a product, then you haven't done anything wrong yet. You can think about the problem, and you can, for example, integrate building source code releases in your build process. So whenever you build a firmware image for your embedded device, automatically it will not only generate the firmware binary, but also the source code offer, the tar file that contains all the source code, exactly the source code that was used to generate this particular binary image. And if you set it up in this way, well, then for each and every firmware build you will have made, you also have the corresponding source code. And it's a one-time effort you have to do, and no matter whether you do 100 releases of the software further on, it doesn't matter. You always have the corresponding source code. Also, you can decide your software architecture before you start your R&D, and you can think of license compatibility questions and so on. If you think of license compliance after the product has been shipping, then it's very hard. Because, well, often you see lack of good engineering practice, meaning that the old source code might not even be there anymore, right? You've been shipping something 2 years ago, and now suddenly, for legal reasons, you need to produce the source code that was used to generate this particular binary 2 years ago, and maybe the source code is no longer there. Or the engineers working on the product have long left, or as the company in that case, and the customers of that company are in a lot of pressure because there's a legal threat or a legal challenge being made against the product. And you might have already shipped something that's a derivative work to a GPL licensed software, which you wanted to keep closed, but you can no longer have that choice because you've already made a wrong choice in the past. So thinking about GPL compliance after the product has been created is a big trouble and causes a lot of problems. And if you think about it before you do R&D, it's much easier to do. So please keep that in mind. Yeah, Linux and other free and open source software is everywhere. This is a in-flight entertainment system in an which airline was it? Singapore Airlines, actually. Yeah, Singapore Airlines flight, and for some reason they had to reboot it while people were inside. So I was sitting in my seat on the airplane, and I saw this message. Copyright NetFilter core team. Yeah. So do I do a test purchase of the airplane now? Yeah. Linux really and embedded free software is everywhere. You have the traditional markets, embedded network devices. We have telecommunications equipment in the networks, DSLAMs, the systems where your DSL modems attached to at a telephone company. In-flight entertainment in aircrafts, in-vehicle entertainment in cars, personal navigation systems, mobile phones, point-of-sales terminals, payphones. In Germany, Deutsche Telekom has public payphones that run Linux. They don't distribute them, so they don't have a problem, right? I mean, they're not selling their phones to somebody; they just operate them. Anyway, I've found Linux in exercycles, right? Fitness gear that you use for sports, voice over IP telephones, e-ink readers, and so on and so on. You can continue this list until I don't know, tomorrow. And you will find that there is a lot of Linux in embedded devices all over the place, and I think it's just going to grow for the next couple of years rather than go back. Now, let's look at a typical supply chain in the embedded world, right? You have the silicon maker that produces some system on a chip or some CPU module that where actually your Linux and other free and open source software runs on. Then you have a supplier of a reference design. This might be the same company as is making the system on a chip, but many companies have a third-party supplier for the reference design, the development board. Then you have an ODM that does the actual manufacturing and engineering and so on of a circuit board that contains the system on a chip on which the Linux and other open source software runs. And then you have an OEM that's selling the device under his brand name in the target market, wherever he's intending to sell the product. This is the minimum supply chain, right? Often the supply chain is even more complex when the board support package or the software development kit containing the GPL licensed software is supplied by, again, a third party, or maybe a fifth party by now. And then you have multiple companies involved on the ODM or the OEM side, and you get supply chains that are very long. And you have third-party suppliers that have application programs, which again might use free and open source software and thus have to be license compliant. So this can be very simple, but it can also get relatively complex. And if all the elements in that supply chain are not, playing along nicely and looking at their license compliance, then you end up in a situation like this, where the OEM has no clue what kind of software the ODM puts into the product. The ODM has limited technical skill and has no clue what the board support package provider actually did. And the end user buys a product with lots of license violations, which are copyright violations, and has no clue, well, who actually was in the supply chain, who has written which part of the software, who has caused any kind of licensing problem in the first place. And this is sort of the more or less standard case that we've been seeing in the last 5 years when it comes to GPL violations in the embedded market. It's getting better now. It's actually getting better for years, but still this is a situation that's very common to see in that market. There are some other slides on GPL and embedded systems. We have only a few minutes left, so I'm going to go through this quickly. One thing, just some thoughts to think about. The GPL version 2 was written at a time where it was written for the GNU project, which at this time was about creating application programs that ran on proprietary Unix operating system kernels at that time. So the license was not written with the concept of writing the operating system kernel, or even writing or providing the software stack for an entire embedded device, or for embedded devices in general, where things are different. So one of the problems with embedded devices is, for example, the question of scripts to control compilation and installation, where if you develop an application program, let's say, you know, a web browser or something on a PC, then you compile the software on the same system that you actually run the software. If you work with a small embedded device, you do cross-compilation, and then somehow you install it from your compile machine to the actual target device. And now the GPL says the scripts used to control installation have to be provided. Now, you know, but the method of installation may not be a script, and you get